My father said, "I'm walking your stepsister down the aisle, but you'll have to find someone else." I was standing in my childhood kitchen holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold, while my father sat at the table looking anywhere except at me. It was a Saturday morning in March, and I'd driven 2 hours from the city to discuss wedding plans with my parents. My fiancée Rebecca and I were getting married in September, 6 months away, and I'd wanted to confirm details with my father about his role in the ceremony. Instead, he just told me he couldn't walk me down the aisle because he'd already committed to walking my stepsister Vanessa down the aisle at her wedding in August. When I asked why he couldn't do both, he said my stepmother Gail thought it would be inappropriate for him to give away 2 children in the same year, that it would diminish the significance of Vanessa's moment. I set the coffee cup down on the counter because my hands had started shaking. I asked him to repeat what he'd just said, because surely I'd misunderstood. He said it again, slower this time, adding that Vanessa's wedding was planned first and that he'd already ordered his tuxedo for her ceremony. He said I'd understand once I thought about it rationally. The thing was, I understood perfectly. My father was choosing his stepdaughter over his biological son because his wife had asked him to. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened, but it was definitely the most significant. I'd been dealing with my father's divided loyalties for 8 years, ever since he'd married Gail when I was 23. My mother had passed away from cancer when I was 19, and my father had been devastated. I'd watched him struggle through grief for 2 years before he'd started dating again. He'd met Gail at a conference for his work in pharmaceutical sales. She was a regional manager for a medical supply company, recently divorced, with a daughter named Vanessa, who was 2 years younger than me. Their courtship had been quick, less than a year from first date to wedding. At the time, I'd been happy for my father. He'd seemed lighter, more alive than he'd been since my mother died. Gail had been pleasant enough in the beginning, always smiling and asking about my life. Vanessa had been polite but distant, wrapped up in her own world of college and boyfriends. I'd thought we could make it work as a blended family. The problems had started small. My father missing my graduation from business school because Vanessa had a sorority event the same weekend. Him canceling our annual fishing trip because Gail wanted to take a family vacation to the Bahamas, and when I'd asked to come along, she'd said it was for immediate family only. Him selling my mother's china cabinet without asking me if I wanted it because Gail needed the space for her own furniture. Each incident had been explained away as a misunderstanding or a scheduling conflict, or me being too sensitive. But they'd accumulated over the years into a pattern I couldn't ignore anymore. The kitchen felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in. My father was still talking, explaining that Vanessa's wedding was a big deal because it was her first marriage, and she'd been planning it for over a year. He said my wedding was more casual. We were having it at a vineyard instead of a church, so maybe I could have a friend walk me down the aisle, or Rebecca's father could escort both of us. I interrupted him and asked if he understood what he was saying. I asked if he realized he was telling his only son, his only child from his marriage to my mother, that he couldn't participate in a major life milestone because his wife's daughter took priority. His face reddened and he said I was making this about competition when it wasn't. He said Gail's feelings mattered and that keeping peace in his marriage was important. I asked where I ranked in his priorities. He didn't answer. I picked up my keys from the counter and told him I needed to leave before I said something I'd regret. He called after me as I walked toward the door, saying we could discuss this like adults. I kept walking. When I got to my car, my hands were shaking so badly I had to sit in the driveway for 5 minutes before I felt steady enough to drive. Rebecca knew something was wrong the moment I walked through the door of our apartment 3 hours later. She was sitting on the couch with her laptop, working on the seating chart for the reception, and her face shifted from concentration to concern when she saw my expression. I told her what my father had said. She closed the laptop and just stared at me for several seconds before asking if I was serious. I said I wished I wasn't. She stood up and started pacing, which was what she did when she was angry and trying to process. She asked what I was going to do. I said I didn't know. Part of me wanted to call my father and tell him to forget it, that if he couldn't walk me down the aisle, then he wasn't welcome at the wedding at all. But part of me still hoped he'd come to his senses and realize how messed up this was. Rebecca sat back down next to me and took my hand. She said whatever I decided, she'd support me completely. She said it was my choice whether to have my father at the wedding, but that I shouldn't let him or Gail ruin our day. I loved her for saying that, for not immediately jumping to cutting my father out, even though I could tell she wanted to. We ordered takeout and spent the rest of the evening not talking about it, but I could feel the weight of the decision hanging over both of us. If you are enjoying this story already, please subscribe to see more stories like this. I called my uncle the next morning. My Uncle Patrick was my mother's younger brother, and he'd been a steady presence in my life since she died. He'd stepped in when my father had been too grief-stricken to function, helping me navigate college applications and loan paperwork. He'd been there for my graduation when my father had missed it. He listened quietly while I explained the situation, and when I finished, he was silent for almost a full minute. Then he said something that surprised me. He said this had been coming for a long time, and that he'd been waiting for my father to push me too far. He said he'd watched my father prioritize Gail and Vanessa over me for years, and that he'd bitten his tongue because I'd seemed to be handling it. But this was different. This was a boundary too significant to cross. He asked what I wanted to do. I said I wanted my father to choose me for once, to tell Gail that his son came first. Uncle Patrick said gently that I couldn't make my father choose me, that he had to decide on his own where his priorities were. He said if my father couldn't see the problem with what he was doing, then I needed to protect myself and move forward without him. The conversation left me feeling simultaneously validated and devastated. Rebecca suggested we meet with our wedding coordinator to discuss alternatives. The coordinator, a woman named Julianne Fox, who'd been planning events for 15 years, had been incredibly helpful throughout the process. We met her at her office on Monday evening after work. Julianne was in her mid-40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude that I appreciated. When we explained the situation, her professional smile faltered. She asked if I was seriously telling her that my father was refusing to walk me down the aisle because he'd already agreed to walk my stepsister. I confirmed. Julianne leaned back in her chair and said in her 15 years of wedding planning, she'd seen a lot of family drama, but this was a new level of dysfunction. She asked if there was any chance my father would reconsider. I said I didn't know. She pulled out her notes and said we needed a backup plan regardless. She suggested several alternatives. I could walk alone, Uncle Patrick could walk me, Rebecca and I could walk together, or we could skip the traditional processional entirely. Each option felt like a concession I didn't want to make. I told Julianne I needed time to think. She said that was fine, but that we'd need to finalize the ceremony details within the next month to give the officiant time to prepare. I tried calling my father twice over the next week. Both calls went to voicemail. I left messages asking him to call me back so we could talk about the wedding. He didn't respond. On the 8th day, I received a text from Gail. The message said she hoped I understood that my father's decision wasn't personal, that he loved me very much, but that Vanessa's wedding had been planned first, and certain commitments couldn't be changed. She said she appreciated my maturity in handling this difficult situation. The patronizing tone made my blood pressure spike. I showed the text to Rebecca, and she said something I'd been thinking but hadn't wanted to articulate. Gail was the one pulling the strings here. My father was just going along with whatever she wanted to keep his marriage peaceful. Rebecca said it was possible my father didn't even fully understand how hurtful this was, that Gail had convinced him this was reasonable. I wanted to believe that, wanted to think my father was just misguided rather than deliberately choosing to hurt me. But the evidence suggested otherwise. He'd had 8 years to establish boundaries with Gail, to make it clear that his relationship with me mattered. He'd failed at every opportunity. Uncle Patrick offered to walk me down the aisle without me even having to ask. He called me one evening in April and said he'd been thinking about the situation and that it would be his honor to fill that role if I wanted him. His voice was thick with emotion when he said it. He told me my mother would have wanted someone who truly loved me to be part of that moment, and that he'd loved me like a son since the day I was born. I felt my throat tighten. I told him I appreciated the offer more than he knew and that I'd think about it. After we hung up, I sat on the couch with Rebecca and cried for the first time since this whole thing started. Not dramatic sobbing, just quiet tears of grief for the relationship with my father that I'd been pretending still existed. Rebecca held me and didn't try to fix it or minimize it, just let me feel what I needed to feel. When I'd composed myself, she asked if I was leaning toward accepting Uncle Patrick's offer. I said yes. She said she thought that was the right choice, that Uncle Patrick had earned that role through years of showing up when it mattered. The decision should have brought relief, but instead, it opened up new questions about my father's involvement in the wedding at all. If he wasn't walking me down the aisle, did I still want him there as a guest? Would his presence be a painful reminder of his rejection, or would excluding him entirely create a rift that could never be repaired? Rebecca and I discussed it endlessly. She said it was ultimately my choice, but that I should consider whether I'd regret either option 10 years from now. I tried to imagine my wedding day without my father there and felt a deep sadness. Then I tried to imagine him there watching Uncle Patrick walk me down the aisle and felt anger. Neither scenario felt right. I was stuck. One night in early May, Rebecca suggested we consult with a therapist who specialized in family dynamics. She'd found someone named Dr. Michael Brennan, a licensed family therapist with 22 years of experience. I was skeptical about therapy helping with this, but I agreed to try. We scheduled an appointment for the following week. Dr. Brennan's office was in a converted house near downtown, with comfortable furniture and shelves full of books on psychology and family systems. He was in his early 50s, with graying hair and a calm demeanor that immediately put me at ease. He asked us to explain the situation from the beginning, and we spent the first session laying out the history of my father's relationship with Gail, the pattern of prioritization, and the current wedding conflict. Dr. Brennan took notes and asked clarifying questions. At the end of the session, he said something that reframed everything for me. He said my father's behavior suggested a man who'd never properly processed grief from my mother's death and who'd transferred his emotional dependence from her to Gail. He said people who remarry quickly after loss sometimes struggle to maintain boundaries with the new spouse because they're terrified of being alone again. He said this didn't excuse my father's choices, but it explained them. He asked if I'd ever confronted my father directly about the pattern of behavior, spelling out specifically how it made me feel. I admitted I hadn't, that I'd usually just absorbed the hurt and moved on. Dr. Brennan said that before making a final decision about the wedding, I should have one honest conversation with my father where I laid everything out clearly. He said my father might not change, but at least I'd know I'd tried to communicate the full impact of his choices. I spent 3 days composing what I wanted to say to my father. I wrote it down first, editing and refining until I had a clear, unemotional statement of facts and feelings. Then I called him and asked if we could meet in person. He suggested lunch at a diner halfway between our homes. I agreed. The meeting was set for a Saturday in mid-May. I brought my written notes with me, folded in my pocket like a security blanket. My father was already there when I arrived, sitting in a booth near the window. He stood and hugged me, which caught me off guard. We ordered food and made small talk about work and the weather until the waitress left. Then I pulled out my notes and told my father I needed to say some things and that I needed him to just listen until I was finished. He looked wary, but nodded. I went through 8 years of incidents, starting with my missed graduation and ending with the current wedding situation. I explained how each event had made me feel, using specific language, Doctor. Brennan had helped me develop. I told my father that I loved him, but that I couldn't keep accepting a relationship where I was consistently deprioritized. I said his choice not to walk me down the aisle felt like a final statement about my value in his life. When I finished, my father was quiet for a long time. Then he said he hadn't realized the pattern was so significant. He said he'd thought I understood that blending families required compromise. I asked if he'd ever compromised on anything Gail or Vanessa wanted. He admitted he hadn't. I asked why I was the only one expected to bend. He didn't have an answer. The conversation lasted 2 hours. My father tried several different angles, defending Gail, explaining that Vanessa's needs were different, suggesting I was too sensitive. Each time, I calmly redirected back to the core issue. Finally, he said he'd talk to Gail about the situation. He said maybe they could find a compromise. I asked what kind of compromise would make sense when the issue was him walking his child down the aisle. He said he didn't know yet, but he'd figure something out. We left the diner without resolving anything, but I felt like I'd at least said what needed to be said. Rebecca asked how it went when I got home. I said I'd told him everything and that he'd promised to talk to Gail. She asked if I believed him. I said I wanted to. 2 weeks passed with no communication from my father. Then, on a Thursday evening in early June, he called. He said he'd discussed everything with Gail and that they'd reached a decision. He said he'd walk me partway down the aisle and then step back so I could complete the walk alone. He said this way both Vanessa and I would have him participate without him giving either of us away completely. I was so stunned by the absurdity of this suggestion that I actually laughed. I asked if he was serious. He said yes, that it was a fair compromise. I told him that wasn't a compromise. That was him finding a way to still prioritize Gail's wishes while throwing me a meaningless gesture. He got defensive and said he was trying to make everyone happy. I said that was the problem. He was trying to please everyone except the one person who should have mattered most to him. I told him not to bother coming to the wedding at all. He started to argue, but I hung up. Rebecca found me sitting on our balcony an hour later, staring at nothing. She sat down next to me and waited. I told her about my father's ridiculous compromise proposal and my response. She asked how I felt about uninviting him. I said I felt relieved and heartbroken at the same time. She said that made sense, that grief and liberation could coexist. We sat there in silence for a while. Then she said she needed to tell me something. She said her father had called earlier that day, asking if everything was okay with the wedding planning, because he'd heard from someone that there might be family drama. Rebecca had explained the situation with my father. Her father, a man named Douglas Irving, who'd always been kind to me, had apparently been so angry that he'd offered to drive to my father's house and have a conversation with him about priorities. Rebecca had talked him down, but the fact that her father was that protective of me made my chest feel tight. Douglas barely knew me compared to my own father, yet he understood immediately that my father's behavior was wrong. That contrast stared back at me like an indictment. I called Uncle Patrick and told him about the latest development. He asked if I'd officially uninvited my father. I said yes. Uncle Patrick said he was sorry it had come to that, but that he wasn't surprised. He said he'd happily walk me down the aisle, and that we could make the ceremony exactly what Rebecca and I wanted, without the shadow of my father's rejection hanging over it. I thanked him and said I'd let Julianne know we had a final decision on the processional. That night, I emailed Julianne with the update. Uncle Patrick would walk me down the aisle, and my father was no longer on the guest list. Julianne responded within an hour, saying she'd make the necessary adjustments, and that she was sorry my family situation had deteriorated to this point. She said, in her professional opinion, I was making the right choice protecting my wedding day from people who didn't value it appropriately. Her validation mattered more than I expected it to. The next morning, I called the venue and had my father's name removed from the list of approved guests. I called the caterer and reduced the head count by 3. My father, Gail, and Vanessa. Each call felt both empowering and devastating. My father tried calling me 6 times over the next 3 days. I didn't answer. He left voicemails that progressed from conciliatory to angry to pleading. The final message said I was making a mistake by letting pride destroy our relationship. That family was supposed to forgive each other. The irony of him lecturing me about family values while refusing to prioritize his own son wasn't lost on me. I saved the voicemails. not because I planned to listen to them again, but because some part of me wanted documentation of his hypocrisy. Gail sent a text saying I was being immature, and that I'd regret excluding my father from my wedding day. I blocked her number. Vanessa, surprisingly, called me herself. She said she'd heard what was happening and that she felt terrible. She said she'd told her mother that my father should walk both of us down the aisle, that there was no reason he couldn't do both. She said Gail had refused to consider it, and that my father had gone along with whatever Gail wanted. Vanessa's honesty caught me off guard. I asked why she was telling me this. She said because it wasn't fair, and because she'd watched her mother manipulate my father for years, and she was tired of pretending it wasn't happening. She said she'd understand if I didn't want to talk to her anymore, but that she wanted me to know she saw what was really going on. I thanked her for calling and said I didn't blame her for any of this. She said she appreciated that and wished things were different. We hung up, and I felt a strange mix of validation and sadness. Even Vanessa could see what my father apparently couldn't. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this. The next session with Dr. Brennan focused on processing grief and moving forward. He asked how I was handling the decision to exclude my father from the wedding. I said some days I felt confident it was right, other days I felt guilty and cruel. Dr. Brennan said that ambivalence was normal and healthy, that certainty wasn't required for a decision to be correct. He said the fact that I'd tried multiple times to communicate with my father and give him opportunities to change course meant I'd done my due diligence. He said I wasn't required to sacrifice my own well-being and wedding day to accommodate my father's unwillingness to set boundaries with his wife. He asked if I'd considered writing my father a final letter explaining my decision. I said I'd thought about it but wasn't sure what purpose it would serve. Dr. Brennan said the purpose wasn't necessarily to change my father's mind, but to create closure for myself. He said sometimes putting thoughts into words helped solidify decisions and reduce second-guessing later. I told him I'd think about it. Rebecca, who'd joined me for this session, asked Dr. Brennan if it was normal for parents to prioritize stepchildren over biological children to this extreme. Dr. Brennan said it wasn't common, but it happened, usually in situations where the parent felt guilty about the blended family dynamic or where a controlling spouse manipulated the parent into demonstrating loyalty. He said my father's behavior fit that second pattern. I wrote the letter over a weekend in late June. It was 3 pages long, handwritten on good stationery. I explained everything I'd been feeling, the accumulation of small rejections that had led to this final breaking point. I told my father that I loved him, but that I couldn't maintain a relationship where I was consistently treated as less important than Gail's family. I said his choice about the wedding had forced me to choose my own dignity and self-respect over his presence, and that while that hurt, it was necessary. I told him I hoped someday he'd understand why I'd made this decision. I mailed the letter on Monday morning and felt simultaneously lighter and heavier. Rebecca asked if I thought he'd respond. I said I didn't know and that I wasn't sure I wanted him to. 2 weeks later, I received a response. My father's letter was short, less than a page. He said he was disappointed in my decision, but that he respected it. He said he hoped I'd reconsider after the wedding when emotions weren't so high. He said he and Gail would be thinking of me on my wedding day. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, no recognition of the pattern I'd outlined, just disappointment that I hadn't bent to his will. I showed the letter to Rebecca, and she said it told me everything I needed to know about whether I'd made the right choice. I filed it away with the voicemails and other documentation of this disaster. Some part of me knew I might need this evidence someday to remind myself why I'd done what I'd done. Vanessa's wedding happened in late August, 3 weeks before mine. I knew about it only because social media exists, and mutual family connections posted photos. Vanessa looked beautiful in a lace gown. My father looked proud in his tuxedo, his arm linked with hers, as he walked her down the aisle of an ornate church. Gail stood in the front row, beaming. The photos showed exactly what I'd known they would. My father was fully capable of showing up for a child's wedding, just not for his actual child. I looked at the photos once, felt the familiar stab of rejection, and then closed the app. Rebecca found me sitting on the couch staring at my phone. She asked if I'd seen the wedding photos. I said yes. She asked if I was okay. I said I would be. She sat next to me, and we didn't talk about it, but her presence was enough. That evening, Uncle Patrick called to check in. He said he'd seen the photos too and wanted to make sure I was all right. I told him I was processing it. He said in 3 weeks, I'd have my own wedding day, and it would be perfect, because it would be free of people who didn't value me properly. He said he'd been practicing his walk for our processional, and that he was honored beyond words to fill that role. His voice cracked slightly when he said it. I told him I was the one who was honored. We talked for another hour about nothing important, just the comfortable conversation of people who genuinely cared about each other. When we hung up, I felt steadier. The final week before the wedding was a blur of last-minute details and logistics. Julianne had everything running like a military operation. The venue was set, the catering was confirmed, the flowers were ordered, the photographer knew the timeline. Rebecca and I had written our vows and practiced the ceremony with our officiant, a friend from college named Marcus. Everything was falling into place except for one detail I couldn't shake, Part of me still wondered if my father would show up uninvited. I mentioned this concern to Julianne during our final planning meeting. She said she'd already considered that possibility and had hired security for the event. She said there would be 2 personnel checking the guest list at the entrance, and that anyone not on the list wouldn't be admitted. She said she'd dealt with family drama before and knew how to handle crashers. Her proactive approach relieved some of my anxiety, but also made the situation feel more real. I was getting married without my father there, and I'd had to hire security to keep him out. The absurdity of it hit me at odd moments throughout the week. The night before the wedding, Rebecca stayed with her parents per tradition, and I stayed at our apartment with Uncle Patrick. He'd driven in that afternoon and brought a bottle of expensive whiskey to share. We sat on the balcony drinking and talking about my mother, about his memories of her, about what she'd want for me. Uncle Patrick said my mother had loved my father deeply, but that she'd also been clear-eyed about his weaknesses. He said she'd worried sometimes that my father relied on her too much for emotional stability, that he didn't have a strong sense of self outside of their marriage. He said she'd never expected him to struggle this much after her death, but she probably wouldn't have been surprised that he'd attached himself to someone new so quickly. Uncle Patrick said my mother's one true priority had always been me, my happiness and well-being. He said if she were alive, she'd be furious about what my father was doing. She'd have walked me down the aisle herself if necessary, cancer be damned. The conversation made me laugh and cry simultaneously. Uncle Patrick said tomorrow was about celebrating the life Rebecca and I were building together, not mourning the relationship with my father that had died. He was right. I went to bed that night feeling ready for whatever came next. The wedding day was perfect. The vineyard was gorgeous with September sunshine and rows of grapevines stretching into the distance. The ceremony space was set up under an arbor draped with white fabric and flowers. Guests arrived and were checked in by Julianne's security team without incident. My father did not appear. Uncle Patrick and I waited in a private room off to the side while the guests were seated. He straightened my tie and told me I looked exactly like my mother, that I had her eyes and her smile. The string quartet started playing and Julianne gave us the signal. Uncle Patrick offered me his arm, and we walked to the entrance of the aisle. I could see Rebecca waiting at the other end, absolutely radiant in her wedding dress. The officiant stood ready. Our guests turned to watch. Uncle Patrick and I began the walk together, his grip on my arm steady and sure. About halfway down the aisle, I felt my composure start to crack, not from sadness, but from overwhelming gratitude. This man who owed me nothing had shown up consistently for years, had stepped into the role my father had abdicated, had loved me without conditions or scorekeeping. When we reached the front, Uncle Patrick hugged me tight and whispered, "Your mother would be so proud." Then he placed my hand in Rebecca's and took his seat. The ceremony proceeded exactly as planned. Rebecca and I exchanged vows we'd written ourselves, promising to build a family based on respect and genuine care. When the officiant pronounced us married, the guests erupted in applause. Rebecca and I walked back down the aisle together, officially beginning our life as a married couple. The reception was joyful and uncomplicated. We danced, we ate amazing food, we laughed with friends and family who genuinely wanted to be there. Uncle Patrick gave a toast that had everyone crying, talking about my mother and about the importance of showing up for the people you love. Douglas, Rebecca's father, gave a toast, welcoming me into their family and saying he'd always wanted a son. The contrast between the family I'd been born into and the one I was choosing couldn't have been clearer. Around 9 that evening, I was standing at the edge of the reception area catching my breath when Julianne approached me. She said there'd been an incident at the entrance earlier that I should know about. My stomach dropped. She said my father had shown up around 5 during the ceremony and had tried to get in. Security had stopped him and explained he wasn't on the guest list. He'd argued that he was the father of the groom and had a right to be there. Security had firmly but politely told him to leave. He'd stood in the parking lot for about 20 minutes before finally driving away. Julianne said she hadn't wanted to interrupt the ceremony to tell me, but thought I should know. I asked if he'd caused a scene. She said no, just some raised voices in the parking lot that guests inside wouldn't have heard. I thanked her for handling it and felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of me felt vindicated that he'd tried to come, that he'd finally realized what he was missing. Part of me felt sad that it had come to this, but mostly I felt at peace with the decision I'd made. Rebecca found me a few minutes later and asked if I was all right. I told her what Julianne had said. Rebecca's face hardened, and she asked if I wanted to leave, if his attempted appearance had ruined the night. I said no, that it had actually confirmed I'd made the right choice. If he'd really wanted to be part of this day, he could have chosen me months ago, when I'd given him multiple opportunities to make things right. Showing up uninvited after everything that had happened was just another attempt to control the narrative on his terms. Rebecca hugged me and said she loved me and that we had a whole life ahead of us free from that kind of manipulation. We went back to the dance floor and danced to our favorite songs, surrounded by people who actually valued us. The rest of the night passed in a beautiful blur. When Rebecca and I finally left for our hotel around midnight, I looked back at the vineyard lit up with string lights and full of our people, and I felt complete. My father's absence hadn't diminished the day. If anything, it had made the presence of those who did show up even more meaningful. The honeymoon in Greece gave Rebecca and me 2 weeks to decompress and process everything that had happened. We talked about the wedding, about the years leading up to it, about what boundaries we wanted with my father going forward. I decided I wouldn't completely cut him out of my life, but that our relationship would be minimal and on my terms. No more accommodating his wife's demands, no more accepting less than I deserved. Rebecca supported whatever I decided, saying it was my family and my choice. When we returned home, there was a letter waiting from my father. This one was longer, 3 pages of what seemed like genuine reflection. He said attending Vanessa's wedding had been bittersweet because he'd kept thinking about missing mine. He said he'd driven to the vineyard that day, hoping to at least see me from a distance, to be part of the day somehow. He said standing in the parking lot while security turned him away had been one of the worst moments of his life. He said he'd made terrible choices prioritizing Gail's feelings over mine, and that he understood now what he'd lost. The letter ended with a request to meet and talk, to try to rebuild what he'd broken. I read it 3 times trying to determine if it was genuine or manipulative. I showed it to Rebecca, who said it sounded sincere but that words were easy and actions mattered more. I put the letter aside to think about. I called Dr. Brennan and scheduled an appointment to discuss the letter and whether reconciliation was possible or advisable. He read through it carefully and said the language suggested genuine remorse, but that the real test would be whether my father could maintain boundaries with Gail and follow through on changed behavior over time. He asked what I wanted from a relationship with my father. I said honestly, I wasn't sure anymore. The man I'd wanted as a father didn't seem to exist. The actual man I had as a father was someone who'd repeatedly chosen someone else over me. Dr. Brennan asked if I could accept a limited relationship with clear boundaries, or if anything less than what I'd hoped for would be too painful. I said I didn't know yet. He suggested I take time before responding to my father's letter, that there was no rush to make a decision. I thanked him and left feeling no clearer than when I'd arrived, but at least more aware of what questions I needed to answer for myself. Rebecca and I discussed it over dinner that night. She said whatever I decided, she'd support me, but that I shouldn't feel obligated to forgive my father just because he'd finally apologized. She said I could acknowledge his remorse without agreeing to restore a relationship he'd destroyed. That perspective helped. 2 months after the wedding, I met my father for coffee. Just the 2 of us. No Rebecca or Gail or anyone else. He looked older than I remembered, tired around the eyes. We sat in a quiet cafe downtown and talked for 3 hours. He apologized more thoroughly than he had in the letter, walking through specific incidents and acknowledging how his choices had hurt me. He said therapy with Gail had helped him see the pattern of prioritizing her comfort over my needs. He said Gail was working on understanding her role in the family dynamics, and that she wanted to apologize too someday when I was ready. I asked if he understood why I'd uninvited him from the wedding. He said yes, that he'd backed me into a corner where protecting myself meant excluding him. I asked if he'd make the same choice now, knowing the consequences. He said no, that he'd walk both Vanessa and me down the aisle or neither of them, if that's what it took to maintain relationships with both. I asked why it had taken losing access to my wedding to realize that. He said sometimes people don't appreciate what they have until it's gone, and that he'd taken for granted that I'd always be there no matter how poorly he treated me. The honesty was refreshing even if the admission was painful. I told him I appreciated the apology and the self-awareness, but that rebuilding trust would take time and consistent action. He said he understood, and that he'd do whatever it took. 6 months later, my father and I had settled into a careful, boundaried relationship. We met for lunch once a month. He called occasionally to check in without asking for anything. He sent a thoughtful Christmas gift. He respected when I said I wasn't ready to see Gail yet. Slowly, incrementally, he was demonstrating that his apologies weren't just words. Rebecca observed the progress with cautious optimism. She said she was glad my father was trying, but that she'd be watching to make sure he didn't slip back into old patterns. Uncle Patrick said he was proud of me for being open to reconciliation while maintaining clear boundaries. He said forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, and that I could choose to rebuild a relationship without pretending the past hadn't happened. That wisdom guided me through the complicated process of letting my father back into my life in limited ways. One evening in spring, almost a year after the wedding, my father called and asked if he and I could have dinner. When we met, he brought a photo album he'd made. It was full of pictures of my mother and me, of our family before she died, of moments he'd preserved from when things were good. He said he'd been going through old boxes and had wanted to make sure I had copies of everything. We spent the evening looking through the album and sharing memories. For the first time in years, I felt connected to the father I remembered from childhood, the man who'd existed before grief, and Gail had changed him. It wasn't the same as it had been, and it never would be, but it was something. And for now, that was enough. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.